introductions. Nicely done. My name is Celeste Carlisle, and I am the biologist at Return to Freedom. I'm not going to go into great detail about Return to Freedom because I assume all of you know about it if you're at this webinar. So again, thank you very much for joining. Um, this is part of our Informed Advocacy webinar series, where we hope to dig into issues a little more deeply, issues that we hear about in the news or from advocacy groups or from friends. Sorry, I'm also admitting people while while talking to you all. Um, but we're hoping that by digging into some of these issues that are a lot more nuanced than we oftentimes see out in the news or out in the world, that you all participating in these webinars can be really informed advocates and help us to carefully make our way through a really complicated issue that includes ecological issues, multiple use issues, um, and also political issues. So we need to be very well versed in all of those parts of a really sticky management challenge, I'll say. So today we have Dr. David Stoner. He is an assistant professor of wildlife extension and lecturer at Utah State University in the Department of Wildland Resources. He spent his undergraduate years at UC Davis, receiving a bachelor's in geography, and then pursued his postgraduate studies at Utah State University, receiving a master's in wildlife biology and a PhD in ecology. Dr. Stoner studies big animals across large geographic areas, analyzing how animals are affected by plant cycles, human exploitation, and the fragmentation of their habitats. His current projects include mountain lion and horse interactions in the West, predicting anthropogenic nightlight and noise on wildlife habitats, developing decision support tools for management of free-roaming horses, cougar population estimates, movement, and foraging patterns in Utah, and he's an ad hoc instructor in the Quinney College of Natural Resources. Today, he's going to present Relationships Are Complicated, Predator Interactions with Wild Horses. And you all are doing a great job. Please keep your cameras and microphones turned off. Dr. Stoner is going to share his screen so you all can follow along with the PowerPoint presentation. And then at the end, I will jump back on, and anyone who has questions or would like to turn their cameras on and their microphones on, we can engage in discussion that way. And I'll also talk you through how to submit a question through the chat if you'd rather not speak. We are recording this webinar, and we will post it later on our website, but you all are the original gang, the OG, here to take part and hopefully engage in vigorous discussion afterwards, because this is definitely a subject that piques people's curiosity and interest. So I am pleased to hand it over to my colleague and friend, Dr. David Stoner.
Thank you, Celeste. Okay, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Catherine Schenecker, who's with the USGS. A lot of the work that I'm going to present today is a joint effort between she and I. Have been working on these questions for about the last 6 or 7 years. And after that time, we have a few patterns starting to emerge that I'm really excited to talk to you about. A little background on myself. That introduction was quite nice, Celeste. Thank you. But when I moved to Utah in '99 to start graduate school, I worked for a professor here named Michael Wolf, who had started at USU in the early '70s. And the early part of his career coincided with the passage of the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And he was part of some of the early scientific studies on wild horses and burros, their reproductive rates and habitat use. And he also did the original studies looking at predation, the subject of today's talk. And that was how I got interested in this, was talking to him about this phenomenon over the years. And in the intervening 50 years since the passage of the act, a lot of things have happened, and there have been many changes, and there's been a tremendous amount of science applied to this question of wild horses and their place in Western ecosystems. I wanted to bring that out. My old mentor, Dr. Wolf, passed away Halloween night, rather unexpectedly, but I wanted to tip my hat to the old gent who got me started in this. Okay, what we are all brought here by, or what we have in common, is that wild horses really are tremendously inspiring at many levels, emotionally and um, aesthetically, spiritually, and they really inspire us. And I feel quite privileged to work on these animals, and they are, um, uh, but they bring with them many consternations, shall we say, in society. Largely related to their abundance, their potential for growth, and their um, foraging behavior. So while these animals are inspiring, they are also the source of a lot of conflict. And um, this conflict is I have entered the system, or the controversy really is around wildlife. So what we have here, I'm going to show you population trends for horses and deer in the state of Nevada. Now, Nevada is ground zero for the wild horse and burro phenomenon. I'll call it a phenomenon. And what we've seen over the past 20 years is that numbers have increased. So Nevada is home to about half the horses that occur on Western rangelands that are managed by federal agencies. And notice this dip in the population is really not due to hitting some kind of environmental limit, but by aggressive gathers conducted by the Bureau of Land Management. In the meantime, mule deer have shown the opposite trend, a declining one, in which their populations are on a downward trajectory. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this is a cause and effect relationship, that it is um, competition between the two species, although that's not out of the question, but simply that this is the background, and this is what is driving a lot of the controversy around horses, especially as pertains to wildlife, because mule deer are also an important species culturally and economically, with a lot of interest in their conservation. The important thing here is that horses consume a lot of forage, and they live largely in arid environments. They are deserts to semi-desert environments that are water limited and subject to disturbances from overgrazing, from fire, from invasion, from exotic weeds. So these are systems that are very fragile, and horses consume a lot of forage. So right now, although mule deer are still the dominant, numerically dominant species, from the standpoint of total biomass on the landscape, horses outnumber them by quite a bit. So this is one of the concerns, and I work a lot with state wildlife managers. So the question comes up is, how do horses fit into these ecosystems? Um, so it leaves a couple of things. The management options are quite limited, and the biggest one that's used is the helicopter-based gathers or roundups, in which government contractors go out and push animals into corrals and remove them from the range. And what this is designed to do is mimic reductions in adult survival. This number down here, 93 to 99%, these are typical survival rates of mares on the open range. And to provide a little context of what do these values mean, When we use the term survival rate, that is a probability that a randomly selected animal from the population will survive from 1 year to the next. So 99% means they are doing quite well. In many other species, so with mule deer, we look at survival rates of 80 to 85% as being quite good. So when we see survival rates in the high 90s, it tells us these animals live very long lives. However, this approach is not without controversy and has been the focus of lawsuits and protests and sort of an ongoing um, disagreement within the public and management agencies. The other prevailing technique is the use of contraception. And this is designed to reduce fertility in the herd. So just fewer pregnancies occur. It's essentially birth control for horses. And while this is more publicly acceptable and, shall we say, less controversial, it has its own trade-offs. And without going into great detail, the major shortcomings of contraception are that we don't currently have a vaccine or a treatment that has lifelong creates lifelong infertility. The animals need boosters at regular intervals. And then, as this picture shows, very few herds are this cooperative. Many of our wild horses in the West are in remote desert environments, deep canyons, mountains, and they're not nearly as accessible as this photo would suggest. And so between these two, there's been some question about, are there other approaches, management, I'll say quote unquote management approaches to help limit the growth rates of wild horses. And so one of the things that's been brought up, this idea has been around for quite some time, but it's received new or more attention recently. 2018, David Phillips wrote a book on the wild horse phenomenon, and then an excerpt was published as an op-ed piece in the New York Times. And this was his conclusion: just let the mountain lions eat the horses and everything will be fine and dandy. So that brings up this, can, as a natural phenomenon, a natural solution, what does predation get us? Is it occurring? If so, when, how much, to what degree does it actually impact horses? And there's precious little research on this. It's a very difficult question to investigate under field conditions because you're talking about animals in remote settings, and predators are by nature very rare. However, that said, this does seem to be something that is less controversial, that the public is more accepting of natural mortalities than those that are caused by human intervention. So again, we go back to Garrett's seminal work in the Pryor Mountains. And what he found was that, or the literature reports, juvenile survival rates. So these are the survival rates of foals of anywhere from 27% to 96%. So again, going back to what is a survival rate, this is a probability of surviving into the next age class. 96 is very high. That implies that these foals are doing quite well and have a very high likelihood of reaching adulthood. 27% is quite low. And so interestingly, some of these lower rates, on the rates on the lower end of this, were measured in populations that were subjected to predation. However, what Phillips didn't take into account was the compendium or the synopsis of science on wild horses that is published 5 years prior to his op-ed piece, saying that effectively predation was not a solution, that it just was it was incidental. It didn't occur at a frequency sufficient to really have population level impacts on some of these herds. So this was something that Kate and I were really interested in addressing because not much is known about it, and it seemed fruitful. So But before I get into the results of our own work, I want to give you a very brief primer on predation and how it plays out in ecosystems. So this is a story that is quite prevalent. It has received a tremendous amount of attention over the last 15 to 20 years, the story of wolves in Yellowstone. And so the story goes that the elimination of a top predator led to the hyperabundance of its prey animals, namely elk in this particular system, and that the consequence of hyperabundance of elk was that riparian vegetation and the habitat that it provided for songbirds and small mammals was decimated, the erosion occurred, and the system was degraded by the abundance of these large herbivorous mammals. And, um, but should that change with the reintroduction of wolves as a top predator, what we see is elk herds being reduced to more reasonable numbers and the recovery of riparian ecosystems to something that is a healthier, more balanced ecosystem. And should that change again, should predators be lost, we would revert to this degraded state. Okay, so what's important here is to recognize that this model of predation and its impacts on ecosystem hinges on several assumptions. The first of these is that plant growth and abundance is limited primarily by herbivory, namely plant-eating animals consuming the vegetation and either impacting its reproductive rates or its growth. Secondly, that the abundance of our focal herbivore, in this case elk, and its population growth rates are suppressed by carnivores. So in other words, the presence of a predator feeding on these animals reduces their abundance and or reduces their rate of growth. And then lastly, that carnivore abundance is independent of their prey, that it is regulated by other things. And we call this the top-down model. And this model has received tremendous attention. It's been highlighted in magazines, in newspapers, in documentaries. My daughters even learned about it in elementary school as the role that predators play in an ecosystem. And the thing is, it's a very seductive story because it's simple, it's intuitive, it makes sense to us. However, it is missing a few key elements. The first of which is that it really does not consider the role of climate. And I know many of our listeners today are not in the West, but one thing I want you to take away from this is that Western ecosystems are not simply dry, but they are highly variable, and drought is actually a pervasive feature. So we talk about it as though it were unusual or an anomaly. It is not. As this graph shows, the dashed line represents the average across time, and notice that there are very few years where we actually receive average precipitation. We have wet years and we have dry years, and we don't have a whole lot in between. And so this really has to be considered when we talk about animals and their abundance and the role of predation and population growth rates. So another model, and this is one that's got a tremendous amount of scientific support, is on what we call the 10% rule. And this is looking at ecosystems from the standpoint of solar radiation coming into the Earth. And approximately 2% of the solar radiation or energy from the sun is taken in by plants through photosynthesis and converted into plant biomass. So that gives us our primary production. Plants are taking energy from the sun and converting it into something edible to other organisms. We then have herbivores, our plant-eating animals that consume the plants, and approximately 10% of the energy they consume is converted into animal biomass. And this pattern proceeds. We go up to our omnivores. These are animals that eat both plants and animals, and approximately 10% of that energy is converted into animal biomass. And at the very, very top of the food chain is our top carnivore. And these eat only animals, and the larger the carnivore, the larger their food items. So our mountain lion here, for example, consumes largely deer. Deer are the major food resource, and a deer is about the same size. So they're eating animals of approximately their own size, which means they occur at very, very low numbers in an ecosystem. Okay, let's go back to the idea of drought or let's say precipitation varying across time. If we have a wet year in a desert means more plant biomass is available for animals to consume. And when animals have adequate or surplus food, they can convert that into reproduction. So in a good year, we're going to see higher rates of reproduction. We're going to see higher juvenile survival rates. Conversely, in a dry year, we see the opposite. There's less food. The system is food limited. A lot of the female mammals will not have adequate food for lactation, and they may reproduce, but their offspring have a very much lower chance of surviving. So this is the alternative model, and it also hinges on some assumptions. One is that small changes to the primary production have exponentially greater impacts as we move up trophic levels. So the herbivores are affected, the omnivores, and then ultimately the carnivores, which I think of this as the analogy that I like to use is that of a whip, in which a small shake of the handle leads to a loud crack at the other end. So imagine our vegetation being the handle and our top carnivores being the end of the whip. So our assumptions of this are that plant growth and abundance is limited by soil, sunlight, and climate, namely the habitat. That abundance and growth rates of herbivores are limited by the amount of palatable vegetation. So importantly, not all plants are equally fruitful or palatable. Some are poisonous, some are thorny, some are out of reach. So it really is just a subset of the plant community that is available to these animals to consume. And then lastly, carnivore abundance is limited by the abundance of their major prey. And when I say here in parenthetically juveniles, this may be a sad story, but the young really form the basis of the food chain for these carnivores. So when we have years in which reproduction is short or we have a collapse of a cohort, that will have impacts at higher trophic levels. And this is called the bottom-up model. Okay, so with that, I'm going to summarize that point with a quote from E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson was a Harvard ecologist who really was an exemplar of our field. I don't think he's alive anymore, but one of the books that he wrote was called The Diversity of Life. And he said this about top carnivores, that they are predestined by their perch at the apex of the food web to be large in size and sparse in numbers. They live on such a small portion of life's available energy as to always skirt the edge of extinction, and they are the first to suffer when the ecosystem around them starts to erode. So what I want you to take away from this is that our Yellowstone model of carnivores basically running the whole system is certainly simplistic and rather naive. I'm not saying that it is totally inaccurate, but that the conditions under which we see that are quite limited, and that this as exemplified by Wilson's quote here, is really more the way nature operates. Okay, so we have two models. How can we use these to understand more about the relationships between predators and wild horses? Well, as it turns out, most equids, most wild equids, meaning undomesticated, are subject to some level of predation. So here's an example. The Przewalski's horse in Mongolia are preyed upon by wolves. Horses as livestock are also preyed upon by predators. The snow leopard is a major predator of domestic horses in Mongolia. And then some of our best science comes from the systems in East and Southern Africa involving zebras. And zebras have a long evolutionary history with African lions. And a lot of what we know about these relationships comes from these two species. All of these have relevance to the subject of predators on wild horses in the West, but none of them are perfect analogs. So, what does that mean? Well, going back to the comments of our journalist friend saying that just let the predators consume the horses, let's take these one by one and take a look at them. In North America, we have 4 species that are capable of hunting ungulates. Now, when I say ungulate, what I mean is a hoofed mammal, such as a deer, elk, moose, goat, sheep, horses, etc. All of these species that you're seeing here do take some ungulates to some degree. I start with the bears on the left side of the screen because they're the least effective predators of ungulates, whereas wolves and mountain lions, that's really the staple of their economy. But I'm going to discuss these in turn. So the first one here, I think this video is quite nice in that it pretty much says it all. This is footage shot in Alberta. This is a grizzly bear, and maybe you've seen this already. Okay, so what I want you to take away from that is that those horses were going at a pretty easy canter, and that bear was a long, long ways behind them. He had really no chance of catching up to them. So the bear, that was a grizzly bear, is really not likely to be an effective predator of wild horses. And in fact, in my research, I have found no examples of it happening, although I'm sure somewhere it has. Moving on to wolves, I want to walk you through this graph because this is really important in understanding how predators affect their prey populations. Because remember, the hypothesis that's been put forth is just let predators do their natural job and everything will be fine. And wolves are put forth as a potential solution, and there's a lot of focus on wolves because of the reintroductions and because of the vast amount of research that's being conducted on them in the Western US. So these are data from in and around Yellowstone. We have 2 things going on here. The gray bars represent the frequency of wolf predation on elk as a function of elk age. So 0, this means these are newborns or they're calves, they're youngsters. The black bars represent the frequency of hunter kills. So wolves and humans. And this black line here represents the reproductive value of elk at any given age. These are all female elk. There are no bulls in here. And I use elk as the example because there's a lot of work that's been done on them, but the elk is a big animal. It's close in size to a horse. And so these are the habits of wolves hunting a large, dangerous prey item. And what I want you to take away from this is that wolf predation is heavily focused on calves. Calves are far and away the major prey resource. And then once those calves hit 1 year old, they're pretty safe until they hit 11, 12, 13. They get into their teens, and you can see the frequency rises again. Why? Because as these animals get older, they are encumbered by injuries, by arthritis, perhaps malnutrition. Their vision and their hearing is not as sharp, and so they just become more vulnerable to predation as they get older. And notice how that corresponds to this reproductive value line. The calves have not hit sexual maturity yet. There's a high likelihood of them not making it to their first birthday, so their reproductive value is low. But once they hit about 2 years old, they're at this high point. And the reason these are the most reproductively valuable animals is they have their entire reproductive lifespan in front of them. So they have many years to produce calves and replace themselves and others. Notably, look at where the hunters are taking animals. Hunters are taking animals in this prime age group. And the reason for this, the reason for these patterns is pretty simple. As the photo here shows, wolves will go into a herd of animals and they will test different animals. And most elk are not vulnerable to predation, but once an animal shows that it is vulnerable, say it's slower or has a limp or some is compromised in some way, that's when they focus on. So if you're hunting with your teeth, you want to go for the animal that's going to be the most manageable and least dangerous. Humans hunt with a high-powered rifle, often from hundreds of yards away. So a hunter is not looking at handicaps or slowness. The hunter is looking for the optimal shot, which is an animal standing broadside still. So it ends up being a random selection of the population. So the hunter kill, pound for pound or animal for animal, actually has more potential impacts on the growth rate of that population. So what I'm getting at here is that wolves have a relatively low impact on the growth rates of a population because of the individuals that they're selecting from that population, pre-reproductive or post-reproductive. Okay, so yeah, but the question remains, do wolves actually prey on horses? Well, there actually is some evidence for this. I showed you a moment ago the abstract from the Mongolian horses. The Przewalski's horse has been subjected to predation that's been documented largely on the foals. I reviewed a paper several years ago from some scientists in Portugal. They were talking about predation on mountain ponies, which are not quite feral, but not quite, let's just say, those animals were free-ranging horses that did have owners, but were managed in a very casual manner. And then in British Columbia, as this paper shows, there's been evidence for wolves consuming horses. But because of the analytical approach, these were the scientists there were they were analyzing scats. And so what they could say is horse hairs and horse DNA showed up in wolf scats, whether that was active predation or they were scavenging on winter-killed animals is unknown. We don't know if they were hunting them or just consuming carcasses. And then also the same thing in Oregon. So I'm currently involved in a project with the Warm Springs tribe in northwestern Oregon. That reservation has about 5,000 wild horses. It is the most dominant, numerically dominant ungulate in that system. There are elk, there are deer, and wolves have moved in. And these are some photographs that my student has sent me. This one is a wolf carrying a horse leg, and then down here we've got a bear that's sitting on a horse carcass as the wolves are coming in and trying to feed. Again, whether the wolves killed the horse or just consuming an animal that died of other causes, we don't know yet. Perhaps in a year or two, I can come back and provide a little more information on that. But the point is that there's not a lot of compelling evidence that wolves are hunting horses. And moreover, we've got a more fundamental problem, which is the two species just don't overlap in very many parts of the West. This is the wolf range largely as it looks right now. And then this is the horse range over here. So it's conceivable that some of these herds in Montana and northern Wyoming could be exposed to wolf predation, but otherwise, most of the wild horse herds in the West just do not they're not encountering wolves at all. Okay, all right, let's get to the star of the show here, the mountain lion. So I've been working on a project in southeast Nevada for about the last 6 years. We have collared mountain lions. We have used the location data from their collars to find what we call kill sites because they exhibit very characteristic behavior when they make a kill. They will sit in one location for several days or come back to it for days on end because they are, again, hunting large animals. They cannot consume them in one sitting, so they'll bury them, go out, come back, feed again, etc. And this is a very reliable way of counting the species and number of prey items that they have. These photos are taken from a trail camera that we have set up. Notice that the horse walked by at the 6:51 and 36 seconds. The mountain lion came by at 6:52 and 5 seconds. So these photographs are taken about 30 seconds apart. And in an environment like this, it's dry. There's not a lot of wildlife out there. Numerically, that is not a coincidence. Moreover, we do actually have some information from other studies around the West documenting mountain lion predation on wild horses. So this is our study area here. It's just, for those of you, Las Vegas would be down here. So it's just north of Las Vegas by about 100 miles. And we've seen this occur there. I'm going to show you more about that in a moment. We've also seen it on the Nevada Test and Training site, the Virginia range up around Reno, the Montgomery Pass, where my old advisor worked in the 80s, where it was first documented, the Devil's Garden, wild horse and burro territory in Northern California, Pryor Mountain, and then on a reservation in New Mexico, it's also been documented. So there are numerous sites where mountain lion predation on horses has been documented. But what we wanted to know is this incidental or, is it opportunistic or is this really part of what's happening in this system? And it turns out horses are a major component of the diet and in fact are very much an important aspect of this system from the mountain lion standpoint. So what I'm showing you here is a bar graph. These are all individual mountain lions. On the x-axis, these are the sample sizes, the number of kills that we picked up and were able to identify in the field. And deer comprised about 59% of the diet and horses the remaining 41%. This is a large ungulate prey. Okay, so the range here, some of them really just dabbled in the horse business and others that was what they did for a living. So we call these animals specialists. Anything above the population mean, we call them specialists. So these are mountain lions that really focused in on horses as their main prey resource. And then these animals over here were I call them the I call them the conservatives and the liberals. The conservatives are the deer hunters. That's the traditional thing to do, and then the are more are animals that are open to a new way of doing business over here hunting horses. Okay, what about the timing and the age structure of the animals? Well, light blue represents foals. The beige color are subadults, and the dark blue are adults. And then we've got a sample that we could tell it was a horse, but we couldn't tell what age group it was. You know, we maybe had some hair. There just wasn't enough in the remains to identify it. And so what I want you to take away from this is that predation on horses is occurring year round, but importantly, it really spikes during the spring, summer, and fall. And this coincides with the foaling season. So horses in this system start giving birth anywhere from February to March, and they will continue into the fall. So it's a very wide season, unlike deer, which give birth pretty much in June, and that's about it. It's a tighter season. So we've got foals hitting the ground for 6 months out of the year. And we've got some of these mountain lions that have access to them, some that have learned how to hunt them and are actually capitalizing on this resource in what is otherwise a pretty impoverished environment. Remember, it's very dry. Well, what about the question of overlap? So as we saw with bears and wolves, just the spatial overlap is very limited. So it's just not likely those animals have an opportunity to interact. What about mountain lions? Well, they show a much bigger distribution in the West. They're actually pretty common. And what you see here is a map. This was some work I did with NASA several years ago, mapping habitat across the West. White represents the total absence of mule deer. Blue, they occur there, but at low numbers, and then the yellows and reds increasing densities. So what's important to remember here, the mountain lion really is a deer predator. That is its major prey animal across most of its North American range. And so their distribution is tightly intertwined with the distribution of deer. These black polygons represent herd management areas in parts of the West. And what I want you to notice is that some of them, there just is no spatial overlap. The mountain lions don't occur there. Others, they do. So we've got a few in Utah here where deer abundance is low and there are lots of horses. So this is a place we would expect we may see these kinds of relationships occurring. This is our spot down here. It's a herd area, which is it's a different designation. Parts of Nevada, none, and then some of these Forest Service horse and burro territories, which are high in the mountains, good deer habitat. We have more potential for our two species to overlap. Okay, so what we've established is we've got at least some spatial overlap. We've got animals within the population that exhibit some degree of behavioral specialization towards hunting horses. But really, the question on everyone's mind, David Phillips' mind, the BLM's mind, is this incidental or does it have an impact on herd growth rates? And so we did some modeling to try and evaluate this question. And so what's important to remember with horses is they have this legacy of domestication, and domestic animals have undergone artificial selection by human beings. And one of the traits that's selected for in the process of domestication is very high reproductive rates. Think of a chicken. It's laying eggs and it's not even going through the reproductive or the mating ritual. They lay eggs regardless. So horses have really high reproductive rates for an animal of such a large size. So we've got a hypothetical population here, female horses with an AML of 100 animals. This is our target population size. And this is what the population will do unless it's impacted by some kind of controlling factors. It's going to grow at about 18% per year, and therefore the population is doubling within 4 or 5 years. So we wanted to know what would the population trajectory look like in the presence of mountain lions that are dedicated horse hunters. And based on the data we collected in the field, we found that, as I said a moment ago, they largely are hunting foals. And we estimated that they're taking about 40 to 60% of the foal crop every year, which puts them in this range. So remember, this is our target, 100 animals. Purple means it's growing, but very slowly, and it's above target. We're in this blue to green range. So what it looks like is the potential for predation to slow population growth, but certainly not eliminate it and not driving it down into negative numbers here. We still are well above our target population size, even in the presence of chronic predation. So the question, can predation slow growth? Yes, it can, however, not by a lot. And so this is another figure to help explain this. In biology, we measure population growth rates, and to put you on the map here, 1 means a static growth. In other words, it's taking your number, whatever the population is, multiplying it by 1, so the next year you get the same. It is remain unchanged. So 1 is a reference. Anything below 1 means your population is declining, and anything above it means it is growing. And so based on our observations in the field, and then what we predicted based on parameters measured in horse herds around the West, we predicted that this population would grow at about 1.2, sorry, what this means is 20% per year. The 2 represents 20% per year. What we observed was that it was growing at about 12% a year. So that's what I say here. Predation was able to slow the rates from 22% down to 12%. Notice these are still positive numbers. The horse population is still growing, but at a slower rate than what it would in the absence of predation. Okay, I told you we'd come back to this. Again, I can't underscore this enough. Drought is a pervasive feature of Western systems. Its impact on primary production has direct impacts on herbivores and their reproduction, the survival of their young. So this is something we have to consider. So I said a moment ago that deer really are the primary food resource for mountain lions all over North America. This is what deer production looks like in the western deserts where they overlap with horses. Okay, the green line represents the primary production in a given year as measured from satellites. Notice it's highly variable. We had low years, high years, low, high. It bounces around. And these are the number of fawns that were counted at each of those times. And what I want you to take away from this is that fawn production really closely tracks the primary production across years. Again, wet years, dry years, and fawn production is tracking that closely in these arid environments. Well, what about horses? This is an active area of research, so there's still a lot of uncertainty here, but what we're seeing in the field is that horses give birth, or shall we say, foals are produced every year, regardless of range conditions. So unlike a lot of wildlife that are tracking conditions, horses have this incredible ability to produce a foal every year, even during droughts. And so we see what looks like a relatively stable rate of production independent of environmental conditions. And this is important because, remember, going back to our mountain lion population, it was comprised of conservatives and liberals. And what this would suggest is that those animals that are able to integrate horses into their diet and figure out how to hunt them are going to have a real advantage in some of these systems when deer herds crash, but you still have plenty of foals on the ground. So to wrap up here, this is really a few takeaway thoughts on this subject of, is predation a solution to the conflicts around horse abundance? What we found is that it would have to reduce survival rates of all horses less than 2 years old by up to 80% every year. This is a tall order. It's not a realistic scenario. So predation alone is not really likely to, it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve the debate. Our field measures suggest reductions in foal survival of 40 to 60%. And I say under these conditions, and that's important because our study area, there were weather conditions, the number of deer on the landscape at the time, and our system doesn't necessarily reflect other ecological conditions under which horses occur in other parts of the West. So we can't extrapolate beyond our study area. All we can say is that this is what we measured here. This is what we think is going on. Back to the question, is it a natural solution? Well, under low deer densities, where horses take on a more important role in the diet, predation may slow the rate of increase. So we saw the rate of increase drop by almost 50%, and that is beneficial, but you still have horse herds growing at over 10% a year, even under a heavy predation load. And so one of the things I want you to take away from this is that we tend to look at, going back to the Yellowstone example, we tend to look at predators affecting their prey, but I want to spin that around and say what we're really finding is that horses probably are playing an important role in supporting mountain lion populations in these marginal habitats where deer are relatively rare. That's a whole nother question, and there's more to say on it. And again, in a year or two, we'll have more information, but it looks like horses are playing an incredibly important role in retaining mountain lions in some of these really dry, arid environments. And what's part and parcel of that is understanding how mule deer abundance is influencing the degree to which horses are incorporated into the diet of mountain lions. Remember, deer are the preferred prey. It's the prey species they've evolved with. They're much smaller in body size, and so fawns, does, and bucks are all vulnerable to predation, whereas with horses, it really is just the foals that are vulnerable. So deer still are have a major role in this, and that's a wild card that we have not really been able to nail down yet. Okay, so a few thoughts about the future. I do have a student who's working on this, and she will be defending her thesis next spring. And some of the things we're looking at are trying to identify and map landscapes where horses may be vulnerable to mountain lion predation. And there are two factors here that are really important. One, horses are dependent on water, and in their need to access water, their behavior is very predictable. Moreover, many of the habitats where horses occur in the West do not look like big open grasslands. These animals are living in mountains that are covered in forests. This is where the mountain lion really is a particularly efficient predator. So we're trying to map these features across the Western distribution of wild horses so that we can identify units where horse herds may be subject to predation and therefore may be growing at slower rates and maybe not as problematic in terms of conflicts with other land uses. And then we want to go back and use some of these models to try and predict the rates at which these herds are growing with and without predation over a range of conditions. Okay. With that, I want to acknowledge our supporters and our co-workers, our technicians, supporting agencies. The work was largely financed by the Nevada Department of Wildlife and the U.S. Geological Survey with support from others. And we were working on BLM land. BLM was very gracious in providing camera permits and other things. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'd be happy to take any questions there may be from the audience.
Dr. Stoner, thank you very much. I always feel kind of lame at the end of these webinars. We can't really all clap for you, but really a tremendous amount of work and very eloquently communicated. The interactions between predators and prey are so much more complex than I know about. So I don't know. It's really great to hear about this work and to really know that we have to think a lot harder about this complicated management issue than just simply throwing out ideas that we think sound good. So with that, if people have questions, you are welcome to turn your cameras on if you would like. You do not have to, so that I can make sure we're not all speaking at once. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you should have a raise hand icon. And if you press it, you'll sort of go to the beginning of the queue and I can see who's up and I can call on you to ask your questions if you have them. If you're shy and you still have a question you'd like to ask, you can also select the chat feature at the bottom of your screen and type a message. Be aware that everyone can see that message and hit enter and I'll see it. So I'm going to lead off and ask, when we look at something that's a little more complex than maybe mountain lions will control a population of horses, and let's just all assume for the sake of argument right now that control is going to mean different things to different people. There is probably disagreement about, adequate numbers or what's too low or what's too high. But let's not get into that at the moment. Let's just think about the ability to decrease populations or hold populations from growing exponentially in areas where that would be warranted. So when natural resource management agencies, I don't want to call BLM out or just put this all on them. There are lots of agencies that have a hand in management of wild horses and burros and have to be involved alongside other federal agencies. So when new information, or at least more complex relationships of these interactions between predators and prey in a natural resource managed situation come up, how is that information handed off to natural resource managers? And what would or could a natural resource manager do with information like this that you've presented today?
Yeah, great question. So for those of you that are, say, in the eastern states, BLM is a land management agency, and their responsibilities are really, as the word implies, over the land. The only wildlife they have management responsibility for are horses and burros. That's it. The wildlife are under the responsibility of state agencies. So the states will set harvest or hunting limits. They will do translocations. They can do control actions. So the interaction with the animals themselves is conducted by the states. So when I talk about the mountain lions, the BLM will say, terrific, but we have no authority to interact with those animals. So when I provide this to the Nevada Department of Wildlife, so they're quite interested in this. But here's the nuance. One of the things that the states are concerned about is what I was alluding to at the very end, that our horses providing a subsidy to mountain lions that then might jeopardize the survival of desired big game animals. So what I didn't say here, but the question that prompted this whole study was that the Nevada Department of Wildlife was trying to get bighorn sheep reestablished in the Delamar Range, and they were being eaten by mountain lions. And so their concerns were if we didn't have horses here, maybe there wouldn't be any lions or there'd be fewer of them. And this gets pretty tough because the state has really they have we call them levers. Think of a tractor, with different gear shifts. They can kill animals. They can refrain from killing them. They can set seasons and bag limits on the numbers, and they can introduce them so they can put them out where they weren't or subsidize a population. But that's really about all the control that they have. So a lot of this, Celeste, to get back to your question, is about monitoring and helping to inform population models so we can predict what the trajectories are of these different species under different conditions, and should there be a need or desire to interfere or intervene in some manner, either adjusting harvest limits, decreasing or increasing. That's about the limit of what they can actually affect.
Susan, did you have a question? You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. And I just want to remark that holy moly, it is mind-numbing. I mean, we think about things like, oh, how come they don't? And it seems simple or straightforward, but then you start getting into the layers of how even the agencies interact with one another and what they're responsible for is another layer in this multi-layered system. Go ahead, Susan.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving this presentation. I've learned a whole lot, and I did read David Phillips' book, which just very recently, so that is very timely for me. But I was wondering if there's information on how many or how much human take of mountain lions is impacting their population, or if it's insignificant. If we have information on that, because I'm thinking that, if we're not limiting their population growth, could they possibly have a greater effect on wild horse populations? I mean, I know the government has spent a lot of money on reducing coyote populations, and ranchers are allowed to kill certain individuals that they think are, causing loss to their herds. I'm just wondering if you have any info on that. Thank you.
Yeah, Susan, that's a terrific question. I'm glad you asked it. I actually wrote my dissertation on that subject. So so where Phillips went wrong, what's inaccurate is he really focuses on the federal agent. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has an agency called Wildlife Services, and they handle conflicts with agriculture, livestock depredation is the term we use. When there is, let's say, in most of the depredation with mountain lion, I'll leave coyotes to the side for the moment. They are another kettle of fish. But with mountain lions, most of the depredation is on sheep, domestic sheep. Cattle are not affected much at all. So these agents of wildlife services are brought in to remove depredating animals. So a problem individual. It's not a population scale removal. It's I have an animal that's causing me problems. I want it removed. And so if you look at the total take on an annual basis by wildlife services of mountain lions in Nevada or Utah, it's probably going to be 30 to 50 animals statewide over the course of a year. So it's trivial from a population standpoint. That said, most of the population scale, the potential for population scale reductions is through sport harvest, and that's regulated by the state agencies. So just hunting. I've mapped this out. This is another thing I could have brought in. I wanted to keep it as simple as possible, but in Utah, at least, there's very little hunting of mountain lions where the horses occur. And this is for several reasons. The first is that, as I mentioned several times, in these desert environments, they just don't support large populations. So hunters are going to go after, I want to hunt where I'm going to encounter my quarry. We use snow to track. So these have got to be areas that get snowpack, and they've got to have big wintering game herds. So where we see the hunting of mountain lions occur in most of these western states are in areas where the deer are migrating onto winter ranges. There's a lot of deer. All the mountain lions follow them. And so a hunter is going to encounter them more frequently. The horses occur in these desert environments. They don't get much snow. They don't have much road access. The population densities are low, so there's almost no hunting at all. Where we worked in the Delamars, it was open to hunting, and some of our animals were lost through sport harvest, but it ranged from about 0 to 3 animals per year. So under those circumstances, it probably was not reducing the population to a point that would really affect the predation on the horses. But one last thing, and I didn't mention this, but most of those horse specialists were adult males. And the reason is they're bigger, they're about 50% bigger than a female, and they have the strength to go after bigger prey. I'll tell you, it's impressive to see an adult horse taken down by a mountain lion, and I've really been quite bewildered by that. It does happen occasionally. So I'd say, just to wrap this up, I'm going on too long, but the composition of the animals, the individual animals that are removed is probably more important than the total number. Meaning those adult males have a bigger impact on the horses than the females. The females are much more conservative in their approach, because if they get hurt hunting, their kittens are going to starve, and that's it. So they tend to go for deer and smaller, the fawns. And a horse is a tough project. So that's probably more information than you needed, but it starts to get at that idea of can we allow lion populations to increase, and they'll take a bigger bite out of the herds.
Thank you.
And Chris, did you have a question? Okay. Anybody else? I know we're sort of up against our time. I am really, really pleased, Dr. Stoner, that you were able to spend time with us. These systems are not straightforward, and it is fascinating. And it's also fascinating just hearing how you have to lay out your studies to pursue something like this. And so I just have one more question, and then I'll wrap us up if no one else has any. But when presented with a research question about these large carnivores, how do you think through how you're going to lay out the actual research in establishing camera traps, or determining how many animals you want to target for radio collaring, and all of that sort of field, the sort of pre-thought that has to go into setting up a really comprehensive field study that involves these large, dynamic, and, as far as I know, really shy and evasive carnivores.
Yeah, well, it's two things. One is money. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of dough to do these projects, and time is the other one, because these are observational studies, and our objective is to get as much data as we possibly can. And in a system where we never had more than 3 or 4 mountain lions collared at any given time, and then they leave the study area or they die or whatever happens, you're just really limited in terms of your ability to sample. So this is why these partnerships with the state, the agencies were so critical, is that we needed a houndsman to go out and catch the lions, which is no simple trick, especially in these environments that don't have a lot of roads, they don't have a lot of snow cover, there aren't a lot of animals out there to begin with. You're talking maybe 10 days in the field to get one animal on the air. And then we had to set up a camera grid, which it turned out to be about 60 cameras spaced at 7 kilometers by 7 kilometers to try and get an estimate of how big the horse and the deer and the horse herds were, so that we can compare, what are the mountain lions? Are they choosing the horses, or are they just taking them opportunistically? And so that's the subject of Hannah's thesis. Maybe if we want to do this again in next summer. So yeah, we need ongoing commitment, financial commitments. We need personnel. We need years, because these systems are never the same one year to the next. They are very dynamic. I showed you the drought maps or the precipitation graphs. The other curveball is that sometimes we get really wet summers. The monsoonal effect can be big, and that's a saving grace, because then you get a second growing season right when the fawns and the foals, or when the adults are lactating and they're trying to feed their young. And then some years are totally dry and you don't have that at all. So there's a lot of sources of variation that you just are not going to capture in a 2 or 3 year study. So yeah, we measure everything we can, and hope that the patterns are robust enough that we actually see some things. And we got quite lucky in that it was very clear what was going on. The horses living in mountainous terrain, forested terrain, are vulnerable to predation to mountain lions because of the way their natural history, the way they behave and operate.
Well, thank you so very much. Really appreciate you spending the time with us. And also, I want to thank everybody that signed up today. Our webinar series, our Informed Advocacy webinar series, we do ask for a sort of sliding scale of donation, and that enables us to be able to operate the administrative side of doing these things, but also goes directly to feed the horses and burros at the sanctuaries. So we are very grateful to you all for participating. I'm going to wrap up with just a little bit about Giving Tuesday. We're really grateful for you all. Our website and our social media, you'll be able to find other ways you can help, including sending messages to your members of Congress. Giving Tuesday comes up right after Thanksgiving. We will send information out to you all. It's a great opportunity to stretch any donation to help wild horses and burros at Return to Freedom, and to help with our work, part of which is this reaching out to engage with the research community and really, really deeply understand what is necessary to continue to have horses on our public lands, and that those public lands support those horses by the incredibly complex layers of management that are required for everything else that's out there. And that includes the wild horses and burros, of course. So very grateful to you, Dr. Stoner. Thank you so much. Everyone who participated today, thank you so much. You know how to find us. You're welcome to email us. If you had questions you'd like to dig into more, I can get them to Dr. Stoner and we can get answers back to you, or resources. So please reach out. And thank you very, very much. I guess that's it.